It started as a simple weekend camping trip, something I had done plenty of times before. I wasn't new to the outdoors, and I had no reason to think this trip would be any different. The plan was to drive out to a remote section of national forest land, park at a small pull-off I had found on a map, and hike a few miles in to set up camp for the night. No official trails, no campgrounds, just raw, untouched wilderness. It was late October, and the air had that crisp bite that signaled winter was creeping in. The trees were mostly bare, with only a few stubborn leaves clinging to the branches. The sky was dull gray, and the forecast had mentioned a chance of rain overnight, but nothing too serious. I arrived at the pull-off in the early afternoon, parked my truck, and shouldered my pack. I had everything I needed: plenty of food, water, extra layers, a GPS, and a reliable old compass just in case. I had even printed out a topographic map of the area, though I figured I wouldn't need it much. The hike in was peaceful. The forest was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy. Just the occasional rustling of dry leaves or the distant call of a bird. I moved at a steady pace, following an old game trail that I had spotted on satellite images. It was overgrown, but still visible enough to follow. After about 3 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was flat, surrounded by thick trees, and had a small stream running nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and cooked myself a simple meal as the sun dipped lower in the sky. As night fell, the woods took on a different feeling. The temperature dropped quickly, and the silence became even more noticeable. There was no wind, no distant traffic noise, just the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of unseen creatures moving through the brush. I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the warmth, before finally crawling into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint red glow outside my tent. Everything was still, too still. I listened, holding my breath, but I couldn't hear anything out of the ordinary. No footsteps, no animals, no wind, just silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just woken up from a dream. I rolled over and forced myself to go back to sleep. Morning came with a thick layer of fog hanging in the trees. Everything felt damp, and the air was even colder than the night before. I made some coffee, packed up my gear, and got ready to hike back. That's when I realized something was off. I should have been able to see the game trail I had followed in, but it wasn't there. The fog made it difficult to see too far, but even walking a short distance in the direction I thought I had come from, I found nothing. I pulled out my GPS, but the screen was blank. Dead battery. That didn't make sense. I had charged it before leaving. Frustrated, I took out my compass. At least that still worked. I knew I had come from the west, so I started walking in that direction, keeping an eye on my compass to make sure I wasn't veering off course. The fog made it hard to tell if I was covering new ground or backtracking, but I figured as long as I kept heading west, I would eventually find the road. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. I wasn't making progress. I should have reached my truck by now. Even if I had gotten turned around a little, the area wasn't that big. I should have at least seen some kind of landmark I recognized. Panic started creeping in. I forced myself to stop and take stock of my situation. My water was still mostly full, I had some food left, and I could make a fire if I needed to. I wasn't in immediate danger, but I needed to figure out where I was before the sun went down. I decided to climb a tree to get above the fog and look for the road. Took some effort, but I managed to get high enough to see. Nothing. Just endless trees fading into the mist. No road. No sign of human presence. I climbed down, heart pounding. Something was wrong. I walked for hours. The fog lifted, but I still couldn't find my way out. The forest felt different, wrong somehow. The terrain wasn't what I remembered. The trees seemed thicker, the ground rockier. It was like I had wandered into a completely different part of the forest. As night approached, I knew I had to stop and set up camp again. I found another small clearing, built a fire, and tried to stay calm. Then I heard it. A sound in the distance. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something moving through the trees. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, listening. It stopped. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows through the woods. I strained my eyes, but I couldn't see anything beyond the trees. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound was gone. I barely slept that night. Every small noise set my nerves on edge. I kept my knife close, even though I had no idea what I was afraid of. Morning came and I packed up quickly. I needed to get out. I hiked all day, trying different directions, but it didn't matter. Every time I thought I was making progress, I would end up somewhere I had already been. It was impossible. By the third night, I had stopped feeling hungry. I was exhausted, but too afraid to sleep. The forest was playing tricks on me. I would see things out of the corner of my eye, shadows shifting, movement just beyond my vision. The sound came back, closer this time. Not footsteps, not breathing, just movement. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I didn't care which direction, I just ran. Branches tore at my clothes. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. I stumbled into a clearing and saw something that nearly made me collapse with relief. A road, a paved, two-lane road cutting through the trees. I don't even remember running to it. One moment I was in the forest, the next I was standing in the middle of the empty road, gasping for breath. I followed the road for miles before finally finding a small service station. I must have looked like hell, dirty, scratched up, eyes wild, because the guy working there barely asked any questions before offering me water and letting me use his phone. I never found out what happened. My GPS was fried. My compass? The needle was spinning in slow circles when I checked it. I went back once, weeks later, with some friends. I wanted to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. We never found the place where I camped. The pull-off where I had parked my truck was still there, but the game trail? Gone. Like it had never existed. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I never will again. I've never been the kind of person who liked crowded places. Cities made me anxious. The noise, the traffic, the constant movement, it was too much. That's why I started camping. Being alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of nature, was the only thing that ever made me feel truly at peace. I had been camping for years, always going on solo trips deep into the wilderness. It wasn't just a hobby. It was something I needed. Every few months, I'd pack up my gear, drive out to a remote location, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No phone, no people, just me and the forest. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. I had chosen a new spot, a dense forest in a rural area, far from any hiking trails. It was a place where I could be truly alone. The drive out there took most of the day. The farther I got from the city, the quieter it became. The roads turned to gravel, and soon after that, they became nothing more than dirt paths cutting through the trees. I followed the directions I had written down, taking turn after turn, until I reached a clearing deep in the woods. It was perfect. I parked my truck near the tree line, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent. The sun was starting to go down by the time I finished. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of insects and distant birds. I built a small fire, made some food, and sat in my camping chair, staring into the flames as the night settled around me. Everything felt normal. But looking back, I realize now that I had made my first mistake before I even arrived. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. The first night passed without anything unusual happening. I slept well, wrapped in my sleeping bag, with the sounds of the forest lulling me into a deep sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. I took my time making breakfast, enjoying the silence. After eating, I decided to go on a short hike. There were no marked trails, so I just picked a direction and started walking, making sure to leave small markers along the way so I could find my way back. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows on the ground. I walked for about an hour, stopping occasionally to listen to the sounds around me. That's when I noticed it. The silence. The birds had stopped singing. The insects had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to have died down. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood still, listening, trying to understand what had changed. And then I heard it, a sound in the distance. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. A rustling noise, like something moving through the underbrush. I wasn't scared. Not yet. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or even a bear. I had seen plenty of wildlife on my camping trips before, but something about the way the sound moved put me on edge. It wasn't the random, clumsy movement of an animal foraging. It was slow, deliberate. I decided to head back to my camp. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen. The forest was still silent, and every now and then, I would hear that same rustling sound behind me, always at a distance. By the time I reached my campsite, the sun was starting to set. I felt relieved to be back. I told myself I had just imagined things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I built a fire again, but this time, I wasn't as relaxed as before. I kept looking out into the darkness, scanning the trees. The fire's glow only reached so far, and beyond that, the forest was pitch black. I ate my dinner quickly, listening for any sounds beyond the crackling flames. The silence was unnatural. Even the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, owls, crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. The same rustling sound, but this time it was closer. I froze, my body tensing. It was coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the noise. Nothing. The trees stood still, their dark shapes blending together. I couldn't see anything unusual, but I knew something was out there. I told myself it was just an animal. That was the logical explanation, but something in my gut told me otherwise. I decided to sleep in my truck that night. I locked the doors and reclined the seat, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling in my chest. For a long time, I just lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening. And then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate movement, right outside my truck. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I could hear the faint crunch of footsteps on the dirt. Not the quick, scattered steps of an animal, but slow, measured steps, like someone was circling my truck. I lay there for what felt like hours, heart pounding, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps would stop for long stretches of time, only to start again a few minutes later. Eventually, at some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was rising. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from sleeping in the truck. I looked around, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place. My tent was still standing. My gear was untouched, but the dirt around my truck was disturbed. There were footprints, human footprints. I knew then that I needed to leave. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. As I loaded my last bag into the truck, I heard it one last time, the rustling, but this time it was closer than ever. I didn't hesitate. I jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and tore out of there, my tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow forest road. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. I parked, got out, and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. That's when I saw it. There was something stuck under the windshield wiper, a small, folded piece of paper. I reached out with shaking hands and pulled it free. 3 words were written in smudged pencil. "You were lucky. I never went back, and I never camped alone again." I still think about that trip sometimes. Comes back in pieces. Small details that make my stomach tighten. The damp smell of pine needles, the flicker of a campfire burning low, the sound of something moving outside the tent. I remember the feeling of being watched, that deep, primal fear that tells you something isn't right. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 21. My stepbrother, Ryan, was a year older than me. We weren't particularly close growing up. Our parents got married when we were both in our teens, and by then we had our own lives. He was into sports, always hanging around with his team. I was quieter, more into hiking and being outdoors. We only really saw each other at family events, and even then, it was mostly polite small talk. That summer, though, we ended up planning a camping trip together. It wasn't really our idea. Our parents had been pushing us to spend more time together, and I guess we just went along with it. We picked a spot about 3 hours from home, a remote area in Washington state. It wasn't an official campground, just a place we found online that some hikers had talked about. It was deep in the woods, far from any towns or main roads. Exactly the kind of place I liked. We packed up the truck and left early in the morning, stopping once for supplies. The drive was long, winding through narrow forest roads that became rougher the deeper we went. By the time we reached the site, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The place was beautiful. Tall evergreens, a small clearing for the tent, and a narrow river running nearby. No cell service, no noise except for the wind and the water. Perfect. We set up camp quickly, pitching the tent and gathering firewood before it got too dark. Ryan wasn't as experienced with camping as I was, but he followed my lead without complaining. The fire crackled as we ate, the air cooling as night settled in. It wasn't until later, as I was sitting by the fire, that I started to feel off. At first, it was just a nagging sense of unease, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder even when you know nothing's there. I told myself it was just the isolation. We were miles from anyone, cut off completely. It was natural to feel a little on edge. But then I heard it, a sound from the trees, a rustling, deliberate and slow. Not the wind, not an animal scurrying. It was heavier, measured. I looked at Ryan, but he didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the fire, poking at it with a stick. I turned back to the trees, staring into the dark. The firelight didn't reach far, and beyond that, everything was shadows. My skin prickled. Then it stopped. Silence. Nothing but the river and the crackling fire. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. Probably just an animal, a deer or something, but that feeling stayed with me. That night, we climbed into the tent, zipping it up tight. It was cold, but I didn't mind. I liked the weight of the sleeping bag around me. It made me feel protected. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up. I didn't know why at first. I just knew something was wrong. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful steps moving just outside the tent. I held my breath, heart pounding. It wasn't Ryan. He was still asleep beside me, breathing steady. The steps stopped, right outside. I could hear the faint sound of breathing. Not an animal. Human. My stomach clenched. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps started again, circling the tent. Slow, deliberate. Then something brushed against the fabric. I felt the pressure through the material, just inches from my face. I wanted to scream, to wake Ryan, to do something, but I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. The footsteps faded. The breathing disappeared. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won. I didn't think I fell asleep, but the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the trees, the fire reduced to embers. Ryan stretched, yawning. "You sleep okay?" I hesitated. "Yeah, fine." I don't know why I didn't tell him. Maybe I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe I was trying to convince myself it had just been a dream. But then I saw them. Footprints. Deep impressions in the dirt, circling the tent. Too big for an animal. Too precise. Ryan saw them too. He frowned, stepping closer. Were those? Not ours. The words hung between us. We checked the area, but there was nothing else. No signs of anyone. No explanation. Ryan laughed it off, saying it was probably some hunter passing through. But I saw the way he kept glancing around, the tension in his shoulders. We should have packed up right then. Left while it was still light. But we didn't. The second night was worse. The fire didn't feel comforting anymore. The woods felt different, too quiet, too still. We went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening, waiting, and then it came back. The footsteps. This time it wasn't just walking. It was closer, more deliberate. Something pressed against the tent, harder than before. A long, slow drag of fingers, or something like fingers, against the fabric. I could hear the breathing again. Then, a zipper, not ours, a different tent. I realized, with a sick jolt, that we weren't alone. Somewhere, in the dark, there was another tent, one we hadn't seen. Someone had been there the whole time, watching us. I shot up, shaking Ryan awake. "Get up." "What?" "We're leaving." I didn't care how late it was. I didn't care if we had to hike in the dark. I wasn't staying another second. We threw everything into the truck, not bothering to pack properly. As we drove away, I glanced back. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A figure standing just beyond the trees, watching. We never talked about it after that. Never told anyone. But I know what I saw, and I know we were never supposed to leave that place alive. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through the northern regions of Italy. I had been traveling through Europe for months, moving from one country to another, mostly staying in hostels, but every now and then, I preferred to get away from people, to be alone in nature. Camping was something I enjoyed, and Italy had some incredible places for it. I had mapped out a route through the Dolomites, known for their jagged peaks and deep valleys, but I didn't want to stay in the tourist-heavy areas. I had read about a lesser-known forested region just a few hours from the Austrian border, a place where you could hike for days without running into another soul. That sounded perfect. I had all the gear I needed: tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, enough food for a few days. The plan was simple: hike deep into the woods, set up camp, and enjoy a few days of solitude before heading back to civilization. I arrived at the edge of the forest in the late afternoon. The sun was still high, casting long shadows over the thick, green canopy. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I could hear nothing but the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and untouched. By the time the sun started dipping below the peaks, I had found a perfect camping spot. It was a small clearing near a slow-moving stream, with enough open space for a fire. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood, and soon had a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal, ate, and sat there for a long time, just listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful. At some point, I must have dozed off by the fire because I woke up to the sensation of cold creeping in. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the forest was completely dark. I checked my watch just past midnight. That's when I heard it. A sound. A soft crunch. Footsteps. I sat completely still, listening. My first thought was an animal. A deer, maybe. But these steps were slow, deliberate, too controlled for an animal. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint the direction. To my right, beyond the trees. I reached for my flashlight, slowly, careful not to make noise, and clicked it on. I aimed it in the direction of the sound, but the beam only caught trees, nothing else. The steps had stopped the moment I turned on the light. For a long moment, I stayed frozen, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just my own paranoia getting the best of me. I turned off the flashlight and sat there, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. The forest was silent again. I let out a slow breath and decided it was nothing. Probably an animal after all. I stood up, stretched, and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tightly. Inside, I felt safer. The thin nylon fabric wouldn't stop anything from getting in, but it gave me a sense of separation from the vast darkness outside. I lay back, listening to the distant sounds of nature, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly. Something had woken me. I listened. The fire outside was completely dead now. The night was silent, but I could feel something was different. Then I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Soft, steady breathing. Close. Right outside my tent. A chill ran down my spine. My heart started pounding. I was fully awake now, every sense alert. I stayed as still as I could, barely even breathing myself. The sound was coming from just a few feet away. Then, slowly, the breathing moved. It circled my tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves under slow, deliberate steps, pacing around me. I had no weapons, nothing to defend myself with. My knife was in my backpack outside. The flashlight was next to me, but I hesitated to turn it on. If I did, would I want to see what was out there? Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The pacing stopped. Silence again. Then, a soft tap. Fingertips against the nylon of my tent. I nearly stopped breathing. My mind raced. Who was out here? I was miles from the nearest town, deep in a forest where no one should be. The tapping moved. A slow, deliberate drag of fingers along the fabric. I gripped my flashlight, ready to shine it in their face, to at least see who was tormenting me. But just as I was about to move, the sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. My muscles ached from staying so tense. I listened for any sign of movement, any indication that whoever was out there was still nearby. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unzipped a tiny part of my tent door and peered outside. The moon was high, casting enough light to see the clearing. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. My backpack, my cooking gear, the cold remains of my fire. No footprints, no sign of anyone. But I knew what I heard. For the rest of the night, I sat inside my tent, gripping my flashlight, waiting. I didn't sleep. I didn't dare make a sound. At first light, I packed up my gear in record time and started hiking back. I moved quickly, constantly checking over my shoulder, feeling an invisible weight pressing down on me. I never saw anyone, but as I neared the edge of the forest, something caught my eye. A tree, not far from where I had camped, scratched into the bark, deep and fresh. A single word, smile. I stared at it, my skin crawling. I never went camping alone again. I didn't want to go camping with my boss, but I didn't have much of a choice. It was his idea. He had been talking about it for weeks at work, saying he needed a break from everything, that a weekend in the woods would do him good. Somehow I got roped into it. Maybe because I was the only one who didn't flat out say no. Maybe because I was just too tired to argue when he insisted. We left on a Friday afternoon. It was early spring, and the air still had that lingering chill from winter, but the sun was out and the forecast didn't mention any storms. I packed my gear, filled up my truck, and met my boss at a gas station just outside of town. His name was Mark. He was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard that made him look older than he was. He had been my boss for 2 years, and while he wasn't a bad guy, he had a way of talking that made it clear he expected things to go his way. We drove for a few hours, taking back roads that wound through empty farmland and patches of dense forest. The place he picked was remote, far enough from town that there wouldn't be any cell service, which was exactly what he wanted. Disconnect from everything, he had said at work. No distractions, just nature. I wasn't as excited about it as he was, but I figured a weekend off-grid wouldn't be the worst thing. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. We parked, unloaded our gear, and started the hike. It was about 4 miles to the campsite, deep in the woods, near a river. The trail wasn't well marked, but Mark had been there before, and he led the way. It felt colder as we walked. The trees blocked out most of the evening light, and the wind picked up, making the branches creak overhead. We didn't see another soul the entire hike, which wasn't surprising. This wasn't a popular campground with designated spots and fire pits. This was the kind of place only hunters and serious outdoorsmen came to. When we finally reached the site, the ground was damp, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. The river wasn't far. Maybe 50 yards through the trees, we could hear the water rushing over rocks. We set up camp, pitching our tents side by side near a small clearing. Mark built a fire, and we sat around it, eating canned food and watching the flames flicker against the trees. The night was quiet, too quiet. There was no distant hum of traffic, no animals scurrying in the underbrush, no birds calling from the treetops. Just the sound of the river and the occasional crackle of burning wood. I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me. I chalked it up to my own paranoia. Being this deep in the woods, away from civilization, made everything feel more intense. But at some point in the night, I heard something moving outside the tent. Slow, deliberate footsteps, not an animal. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled our tents, crunching over dead leaves, stopping just outside the thin fabric wall separating me from the darkness. I gripped the knife I kept in my sleeping bag, waiting. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. But after a long, tense moment, the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. By morning, I convinced myself it had just been Mark, maybe checking on something outside. But when I stepped out of my tent, he was still zipped up in his, snoring. I told myself I imagined it. We spent the day hiking, fishing, and trying to enjoy the trip, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woods felt off. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a flicker of shadow, gone before I could focus on it. Then we found the deer. At first, I thought it was just a carcass left behind by a hunter. But the longer I looked, the worse it got. The thing wasn't just dead. It had been torn apart. Not eaten. Not butchered. Just destroyed. Its ribs were cracked open. Its insides spilled out onto the forest floor. But nothing had been taken. Even Mark, who had spent his whole life hunting, looked unsettled. Bear, maybe, he muttered. But I didn't see any tracks. The rest of the day felt uneasy. Neither of us talked much. We stuck close to camp, keeping the fire going even though the sun was still up. I kept my knife on me at all times. That night, I barely slept. The footsteps came back. Slow, careful. Something circling the tents just like before. I held my breath, gripping my knife, listening. Then something touched my tent. Not a brush, not a scrape. Something pressed against it, just enough to make the fabric stretch inward. I wanted to call out to Mark, but my throat was dry. I stayed still, waiting, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, the pressure lifted. The footsteps moved away. In the morning, I unzipped my tent the second there was light. Mark was already up, standing by the fire. His face was pale. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not paws, bare feet. We didn't talk about it. We just packed up and left. The hike back to the truck felt longer than before. The woods were dead silent, not even the sound of birds. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. When we finally reached the truck, we threw our gear in and took off without a word. Neither of us ever mentioned it again. I don't know what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I haven't gone camping since, and I never will. It was early October, and the forecast had warned of rain, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had planned this trip for weeks. I needed it. Life had been heavy lately, and getting away from everything, even for just a weekend, felt necessary. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual camping areas, where I wouldn't have to deal with other people. Just me, the forest, and some quiet. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected. The roads were slick from earlier rain, and the last few miles were rough, just gravel and mud. My truck struggled in some places, tires slipping a little, but it made it. I parked near a clearing, grabbed my pack, and started hiking. The sky was overcast, gray and thick, but it wasn't raining yet. The trail wasn't well maintained, which was part of the appeal. It was narrow, overgrown in some places and steep in others. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No road noise, no other hikers, just the occasional bird call and the wind shifting through the trees. I hiked for hours, crossing small streams, climbing over fallen logs, until I found the spot I had marked on my map. A small clearing near a lake, far from any roads or campsites. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The ground was damp, and I had to clear away wet leaves before pitching my tent. By the time I finished, the sky had darkened, and a light drizzle had started. I got a fire going, difficult but manageable, and made myself some food. The warmth of the fire felt good, but I could hear the wind picking up, rustling the trees, making them creak. By nightfall, the rain was steady. The fire struggled against the moisture in the air, and I decided to turn in early. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, listening to the rain patter against the tent. It was soothing at first, the kind of sound that makes you drift off easily. But at some point, I woke up. Something wasn't right. I lay still, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The rain was heavier now, a constant drumming on the tent. The wind had picked up too, pushing against the fabric. I thought maybe that was it, just the storm. But then I heard it. A sound outside. Not the wind, not the rain. Something else. I held my breath, listening. It was faint, hard to hear over the storm, but it was there. Footsteps? No, more like movement. Something shifting, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was an animal. A deer maybe, or a raccoon. But it sounded too careful. I reached for my flashlight, turning it on, but I didn't unzip the tent yet. I needed to be sure before I stepped out into the cold rain. I waited, listening. The sound had stopped. Just the rain now. I stayed awake for a long time, but eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted back to sleep, telling myself it was nothing. The next morning, everything felt normal. The rain had stopped, though the sky was still heavy with clouds. My campsite looked untouched. No signs of anything unusual. I shook it off. Maybe it really had been just an animal, something passing through. I spent the day fishing by the lake, hiking a little further into the woods. By the time evening came, the rain had returned. That night, the feeling was back. I was in my tent, trying to sleep, but I couldn't shake the unease. The rain was heavier than before, and the wind had picked up even more, making the trees groan. And then I heard it again. Movement, closer this time. I sat up, heart pounding. My flashlight was in my hand before I even realized I had grabbed it. I listened, waiting. The sound was slow, deliberate, not the chaotic rustling of an animal scurrying through the underbrush. This was different. I unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. The rain made it hard to see much, the beam of my flashlight catching only glistening tree trunks and dripping leaves. I scanned the area, breath held. Nothing. I almost convinced myself I was imagining things, that the storm was playing tricks on my ears. And then I saw it, a shape, a figure, standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. My heart slammed against my ribs. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a tree. It was a person. They weren't moving, just standing there, in the rain, watching my tent. I didn't move either. I barely breathed. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of nowhere in a storm like this? No campsites, no trails, just miles of deep forest. My flashlight wasn't strong enough to see details, but I knew they were looking at me. I had to do something. Slowly, I reached for the knife I always kept with me when camping. My fingers wrapped around the handle, grip tightening. But I didn't move yet. I just waited, hoping, praying that they would leave. But they didn't. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me sitting half out of my tent, them standing in the rain. But eventually, I blinked, and they were gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I packed up immediately. I wanted to tell myself it was just some lost hiker, but it didn't make sense. Why hadn't they called out? Why had they just stood there? Why did they disappear without a sound? The hike back to my truck felt longer than before. I kept looking over my shoulder, every noise making my nerves jump. The rain had stopped, but the forest felt heavier, like it was watching me leave. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and got in, locking the doors immediately. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, and I pulled away as fast as I could, tires spinning in the mud. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I don't camp alone anymore. I always liked camping alone. It gave me space to think, away from the noise of everything. I never saw it as risky. I was careful, packed well, and always let someone know where I was going. I wasn't the kind of guy to make stupid mistakes in the woods. I respected nature, and I was always prepared. It was the summer of 2018, and I had taken a week off work to go camping in the backcountry of Montana. I had found this area on a hiking forum, deep in the woods, far from any established campsites. No tourists, no loud groups, just miles of trees and silence. It was perfect. I parked my truck at the end of an old service road, shouldered my pack, and hiked about 6 miles into the woods. The area was beautiful, thick pines, scattered clearings, a quiet river running nearby. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no old campsites, no trash. I felt like I had the whole forest to myself. After a few hours of hiking, I found a good spot, a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. I set up my tent, built a fire ring, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped low, I cooked some food over the fire and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the last person on earth. But something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like the woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals moving through the brush, just stillness. I shook it off, blaming my own paranoia. Maybe I had been in the city too long. That night, I slept lightly. Every little sound outside the tent had me waking up, listening. But there was nothing, just wind and the occasional creak of trees. The next morning, I packed up and decided to explore the area. I hiked a few miles deeper into the woods, following the creek. It led me to a larger clearing with an old fire pit in the middle. Someone had camped here before, but it had been a long time. The rocks were covered in moss, and the ashes had been washed away by rain. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. About 20 feet away, nailed to a tree, was an old wooden sign. It was weathered, cracked, barely hanging on. The words had faded, but I could still make them out. Stay out. That was it. No explanation, no details, just those 2 words. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out what it meant. Maybe it was from years ago, an old hunting area, private property, or some kind of warning about the terrain. But I hadn't seen any no trespassing signs when I entered the woods, and this felt different. I turned back and hiked toward my campsite, that uneasy feeling creeping back into my gut. That night, I built up my fire bigger than usual. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched. Every time I looked into the trees, it felt like something had just moved out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had died down to embers. The air was cold, and everything was silent. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. Then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. They were close, maybe 30 feet from my tent, just beyond the tree-line. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. Nothing. Then a whisper. I didn't hear words, just the sound. Low, almost like someone was muttering under their breath. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the knife I always kept by my sleeping bag and stayed completely still. The whispering stopped. Then, the footsteps started again. Moving away this time. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped out. Everything looked normal. No tracks, no signs of anything. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up my gear and decided to leave. Something wasn't right out here. I wasn't the kind of person to get scared easily. But this didn't feel like normal camping weirdness. As I hiked back toward my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened. The feeling of being watched never left. About 2 miles from my truck, I saw something that stopped me cold. A footprint, not mine, and not from a hiking boot. It was a bare foot, wide, heavy, deep in the dirt. Someone had been out here walking barefoot in the middle of the forest. I stared at it for a long time before I kept moving. My skin crawled the rest of the way back. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and locked the doors the second I got inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the trailhead. Something moved, just for a second. A shadow between the trees. Too far to see clearly, but it was there, watching. I hit the gas and didn't look back. I never went back to that area. I never even tried to figure out what I had heard or seen. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some warnings are meant to be taken seriously. I don't camp alone anymore.